Hello everyone. We are returning to ancient history tonight. We're going to discover lost cities. Lost in the sense that they were deserted or rebuilt after they fell, burying their history in the sands of time. And we're going to explore what happened to them. First, we will go to Mycenae in Greece, that shined centuries before the rise of classical Greece. And after that, to Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, one of the largest cities in the world in the 15th century. It was a breathtaking sight, with spectacular pyramids in the middle of a lake that was replaced and rebuilt into Mexico City after the Spanish Conquest. So make yourself comfortable, our journey is about to begin. If you prefer, you know that this channel is now also a podcast available on all audio platforms. Already more than 80 episodes are available on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, with remastered sound. A new one comes out every other day as I rebuild the library of stories there. So you can try that if this is convenient for you. Or you can listen to all stories as music albums too, on Apple Music, Spotify or YouTube Music. There are links to all this in the description and the first comment pinned under the video. And now, let's get started with Mycenae. There is no shortage of representations, stories, books, media of all kinds about ancient Greece. But typically, when we talk of ancient Greece, what comes to mind are periods like classical Greece, in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The times of democracy in Athens, the rise of cities like Sparta and Thebes. A time when the arts, philosophy and science flourished in Greece, and also around the Mediterranean, where Greek cities explored, traded and founded colonies. Or ancient Greece can also be about the following period, called the Hellenistic period. The convention is to end classical Greece with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, and the following period, the Hellenistic period, is characterized by the huge expansion of Greek cultural influence in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, following the conquests of Alexander. His empire did not survive him, but it was replaced with Greek-led kingdoms founded by some of his generals, such as the empire of the Seleucids or the Ptolemies in Egypt, that continued to spread Greek influence and mix it with various local cultures. This period ended in the 1st century BC. Also by convention, with the death of Cleopatra. That marks the end of the last big Greek kingdom in the Mediterranean and the supremacy of the Romans. So these are the two periods, about 500 years, the second half of the first millennium BC, that we generally think about, because they are so rich in stories, characters, events, innovations, battles, many things that would stay as references in the following centuries and to our days, well beyond the limits of Greece. But obviously classical Greece did not appear suddenly in the 5th century out of nowhere. And talking about Mycenae and the Mycenaean period named after it, is an invitation to look at the history of Greece before, during the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. Iron Age to which classical Greece belongs. How did it start? What was Mycenae? And why was it relevant? How did the ancient Greek culture form with its belief system, its language, its material culture? This is what we're going to examine now. Mycenae today is an archaeological site in Greece, 70 miles from Athens, and it was a fortification, a citadel, that dominated the plain under it, the Argolid plain. Its most famous site, is called the Lion Gate. It is a big stone entrance with carved lions on either side of a column. And some of the walls of this fortress are very different from the relatively light and ornate architecture that we associate with ancient Greece. They are made of enormous and irregular limestone blocks, cut to remain well adjusted. This type of walls, of architecture, is called Cyclopean, the use of massive, irregularly shaped stone blocks that are fitted together tightly, often without mortar. Cyclopean because of the Cyclops in Greek mythology, these giants with one eye. Since the walls or monuments built with these blocks seem to have been created by giants rather than humans. Historians use the term Cyclopean when it comes to architecture, building, in a rather restrictive way, mostly for Greek architecture. But this type of build is not limited to Greece. Other examples existed in Europe. For example, the Etruscans in central Italy, or, even though they are not walls, the megalith of Karnak in France, in Brittany, or of Stonehenge in England. These are examples of Cyclopean architecture too. There are more. In the Middle East, in Anatolia, on the site of Hattusa, the ancient capital of the Hittites, which was contemporary to Mycenae, or in South America. The Incas, in particular, used large irregular blocks like that in Cusco. Cyclopean architecture always seems to be very intentional. It had to be, because it would have been much easier to build in bricks or wood. So these huge blocks that can weigh up to dozens of tons were only used for monuments or fortifications that sent a message. This monument and his sacred function, or this wall and the fortification it belongs to, its military or political meaning, are bigger than you, as if giants or gods had created them, not simple humans. So this Cyclopean architecture of the site of Mycenae, this powerful citadel, which once dominated a city thought to have had around 30,000 inhabitants, a big number for the time. This citadel is a first clue about the significance of Mycenae, which for 2 to 3 centuries dominated a small empire. What happened for this citadel to rise and expand its influence beyond the seas? To discover it, we need to go back in time by several thousand years to prehistoric Greece. There are signs of human occupation dating from the Paleolithic in Greece. But the moment when a Proto-Greek culture begins to hatch in Greece is the end of the 4th millennium BC. The Neolithic Revolution, the start of agriculture, arrived in Greece around 7000 BC, 9000 years ago, coming from the Near East. And Greece was probably one of the first, if not the first European region to adopt it and change from a nomadic to a sedentary lifestyle. But the oldest signs of a culture that can be traced to what would become ancient Greek culture come with the arrival of the first Greek-speaking tribes, speakers of the Proto-Greek language, that would later become the Mycenaean language, and centuries after that, ancient Greek. These tribes that brought the Proto-Greek language with them were Indo-Europeans, which is something I already told you about in many past episodes, from the history of Buddhism or ancient Persia to the Celts, Italic or Germanic peoples. So we are not going to repeat this again, but the important point here is that in Greece, like in other regions of the world, the Indo-Europeans had a strong cultural influence, in particular their language, that transformed with time and influences from the locals that were there before. But it seems everywhere they went, these waves of Indo-European migration shifted the culture. And this is how Proto-Greek, an Indo-European language, formed and spread in the center of modern Greece, along the 3rd millennium BC. These Greek-speaking tribes had discovered metallurgy. They lived in the Bronze Age. But at the same time, elsewhere in Greece, in the islands of Greece, there were other cultures that were technically more advanced in some respects. One is the Cycladic culture, from the Cyclades, the islands in the middle of the Aegean Sea. No boats from this culture have been found, but it seems quite obvious that these people had a seafaring culture, given that they lived on plenty of small islands. They were identified as a specific culture of the Bronze Age, thanks to their production of art and objects. Plenty of pottery artifacts with specific patterns have been found in the Cyclades, and also a particular art form. They made a lot of figurines carved in marble, representing people, musicians, groups of people sometimes. Some are bigger and are more like small statues or idols. The other notable cultural area in Greece during a large part of the Bronze Age was to the south, in Crete, the culture called Minoan. I also told you about it in an episode about the Phaistos disk discovered in Crete. It is called Minoan civilization after King Minos, who is a legendary king of Crete in Greek mythology, not a real person. So this name of Minos would appear much later. We don't know how the Minoans called themselves. We also ignore what Minoan society was like, or how they were organized politically. We know them, in particular, through the palaces they built and the art and the crafts they left, which show a degree of technical and artistic refinement that was probably unmatched in Europe around 4,000 years ago, when the Minoans were at their peak. They built elaborate urban settlements, and they traded in the eastern Mediterranean. At the time, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, the great power of the Mediterranean was Egypt, and they acted as middlemen in the trade between Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. Maybe they went further west, we don't exactly know. But there is no doubt that they were skilled traders, because a lot of things that were absent in Crete ended up there, especially metals that they obtained against luxury crafts and agricultural products. We also know various peoples, including the Egyptians, employed Minoans, presumably for their know-how in trade, or maybe architecture, or for their artistry. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, Crete declined. And it seems at least one of the reasons was natural cataclysms that affected the island. Earthquake, volcanism, tsunamis maybe. We know there were several earthquakes around 1600 BC, and one of the earliest recorded large volcanic eruption in the history of humanity, the Santorini eruption in 1628 BC. Santorini is an island of the Aegean Sea, and this eruption, which must have been huge, strongly impressed and stayed in memories. So it must have been devastating, even though we ignore to what extent. This volcanic eruption is thought to have stayed in memories for many generations. And one hypothesis is that it inspired the myth of Atlantis, the lost continent, which first appeared centuries later in Greek writings by Plato, the philosopher. But it could have been part of oral culture for centuries, and Plato would have recycled it. There were probably conflicts, civil wars. But in any case, by the 15th century BC, the palaces of Crete, of the Minoan civilization, all burned down. This is what archaeology tells us. And Crete fell under the influence of the rising power in Greece at the time, Mycenae. Because since the 3rd millennium, as the Minoans developed, the Greeks on the continent had also advanced and created the first distinctively Greek civilization, called Mycenaean civilization. And they had actually incorporated many elements, found inspiration in Crete. These Greek-speaking tribes I mentioned before had expanded to the center and south of continental Greece, and probably influenced by the cultures they came to be in contact with, including from the Cyclades and Crete, they evolved toward a more complex material and political culture. Material because the quantity and the complexity of wares they produced increased a lot in the 2nd millennium BC. And politically, because they started forming states, small states, that were centered on palaces. What does it mean? It is believed that the elite that governed these Greek-speaking tribes consisted mostly of warriors, and in order to control the surrounding area, the rulers started founding fortresses, fortified palaces, that would serve at the same time as their residence and as political, economic, and even cultural and religious hubs. This is why this culture is called palatial culture, because these palaces were the center of everything, the place where decisions were taken, where many economic transactions and production would take place, where diplomacy would be decided, where armies would be stationed, where justice would be served. And Mycenae was one of these palaces, the most successful one. But there were others, like Tiryns and Pylos, also in the south of Greece, like Mycenae, or Orchomenus, Athens or Thebes in central Greece. These were all capitals of the region of the small state formed by their surroundings. States that were rather militaristic. I told you the elite that possessed political power was mostly an elite of warriors, so they would impose their authority in a state controlled by the military. But they also had a sophisticated administration, a rich know-how for arts and crafts, and as time advanced, a more and more outward-looking view of the world, and an interest in trade. It is hard to tell where influences came from, and how they changed them. But these traits were likely to be, for a part, inherited from the Minoans. We know that the contacts intensified in the first half of the second millennium BC, as Mycenaean culture was forming on the continent. Ruling from a palace that is all-purpose, at the same time a political, military and economic center, may also be a trait inspired by the Minoans, but it is hard to tell in which proportions. And the influences may also have worked both ways. So, how were these palaces? Mycenae gives us a good example. First, they were always built on elevated terrain and made to embody the power of their rulers. Hence this architecture with massive stone blocks. They also had, at their core, a structure called the Megaron, a great hall of rectangular shape with columns and a throne used for royal audiences or rituals, ceremonies, probably. Around the Megaron, the palace included all sorts of facilities that reflected its role as a self-sufficient center. Storage rooms, workshops, residential quarters, barracks. Each palace was ruled by a king, an anax, A-N-A-X, or wanax with a W, which are ancient Greek words that meant tribal chief or lord. There are two words translated as king from ancient Greek, anax, and the other one is more famous, Basileus. But for a tribal chief from an earlier period, anax is more appropriate. So, from his palace, this king oversaw a society with a strict hierarchy, nobles, priests, artisans, and at the base, laborers, the vast majority of his subjects. The palaces controlled very tightly the territory around them, and we know this because they kept record of everything: agriculture, trade, tributes paid or received. We know a lot about this palatial culture from tablets in the Mycenaean language that were deciphered. And these tablets contain detailed records like at the same period the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians produced. It is also archaeology that tells us of society and the importance of this elite of warriors I mentioned. Because the elite warrior culture appears in the tombs, the more opulent they are, the more references to fighting and war they contain, with evidence of weapons, armor, or chariots buried with nobles and kings of this civilization. I told you the palaces were also economic hubs. This is evidenced by the tablets that illustrate the management of production of goods. Goods like olive oil, wine, textiles, pottery, all of these for local consumption and trade too. At the time of the Minoan civilization, the Minoans were the go-betweens in the Eastern Mediterranean. But in the second half of the second millennium, the Mycenaeans replaced them, and they start exchanging goods directly with Egypt. At the time it is the new kingdom in Egypt, a period of power and prosperity that makes Egypt a good client and a good source for grain, papyrus or gold. The Mycenaeans of that period also trade with Cyprus, the Levant, Anatolia. And we don't exactly know how far their network reached, but some materials found in Greece from the second millennium can come from surprisingly far. For example, amber from the Baltic was found. It doesn't mean there was a constant trade route between Greece and Poland or Scandinavia, but at least there were contacts. Yet another aspect of the culture that invites to see it as not just a militaristic culture is the refinement of its craftsmanship. We know it through intricate jewelry, sometimes made of gold, bronze weapons that were some of the finest of the Mediterranean world at the time, or the frescoes that were discovered. All of these are actually traits that will keep existing in ancient Greece in the first millennium, the time of classical Greece. The seafaring and trade orientation, the craftsmanship, and attention to luxury in the material culture. Also the glorification of elite warriors, which is something transversal in ancient cultures, probably out of necessity and the constraints of survival. Maybe it tended to appear spontaneously across many cultures, but it remained as a characteristic of Greek culture for much later. The references, the heroes in mythology, the historical figures that were remembered and celebrated, sometimes the social organization of some of the Greek cities, an extreme example being Sparta. All of this shows us that martial values always remained very important in ancient Greece. We may think of the ancient Greeks as philosophers, poets, artists, or inventors, and this existed, but in the representations that this society had of itself, the people they celebrated, and their deeds, the heroic figures they looked up to, warriors remained very central. So I told you the Mycenaeans began to spread their influence beyond their borders as the Minoan civilization declined. We don't know the details at all, but it is not impossible that the Mycenaeans were one of the causes of the collapse of the Minoan civilization. Maybe an invasion, because from the 15th century BC, Crete enters the sphere of influence of the Mycenaeans, of the Greeks. The main palace in Crete, in Knossos, became ruled like Mycenaean palaces, and signs of Mycenaean cultural presence spread in Crete. For example, a Mycenaean throne room, like in the megarons of the continent, was added to the palace in Knossos. The Mycenaeans also colonized the Aegean Sea, taking many islands. And they started in the following centuries a tradition that classical Greece would continue. the tradition of founding faraway settlements, trading posts that would turn into cities sometimes. They did it in Anatolia, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, around Greece itself. And we don't know exactly if there were Mycenaean settlements, but signs of their trade network have been found as far west as in Spain, on the other side of the Mediterranean. One question that remains a bit unclear is to what extent the different palaces were independent from each other, like city-states, or part of a same entity. The consensus of historians today leans towards independence of the palaces. So that would have made the Mycenaean area a collection of small states rather than a single kingdom. The reasons why independence looks more likely include the fact that each palace functioned as a regional center that controlled its own territory, resources, economy, army probably. And at their head they had a king. This word wanax that I explained before keeps being repeated on tablets, and it is a title for a chief that is independent, not for an administrator or a representative of another power. There are other clues too. There were architectural and cultural variations between palaces, which also suggest that they were autonomous. No trace was ever found in archives, no mention of a centralized authority uniting all palaces under one ruler. It would be strange that such an important person would have become invisible in records. And finally, palaces that were well in the center of the Mycenaean area were heavily fortified, not less than the ones near the frontiers. And this suggests that the threats were not only external, they could come from other palaces too. Still, other elements show that there was a sense of unity and cooperation within the Mycenaean culture. They shared the same culture, starting with their language, the same script, a lot of common motifs in their art. So they have regional variations, but they are clearly part of the same cultural world. It is also possible that they regularly collaborated militarily, and some scholars believe that stories of Greek coalitions, such as the one formed during the Trojan War, told in the Iliad, this could be a historical memory of coordination between the palaces, with at their head the most successful, wealthiest and largest Mycenae. There are no direct proof of military collaboration, but economic and trade collaboration is very likely, because the Mycenaean world traded across the Mediterranean, and each city-palace had access to this trade. So it was most probably via a shared network of ports and contacts. Some have also suggested Mycenae might have had an informal influence over the other palaces, because it was the most powerful. And so, without a formal organization and hierarchy between these independent entities, it could have coordinated them, at least at certain periods. So, what was Mycenae like at the time of its splendor in the late Bronze Age, from around 1400 BC to 1200 BC? As we saw, it was a big fortress, a citadel, on a rocky hill above the Argolid Plain, which is a fertile plain that was also a good strategic location, because all connections between the southern peninsula of Greece, the Peloponnese, and the north or the east-west connections between the Aegean Sea and the rest of the Mediterranean, all these routes had to pass close to it. Around Mycenae, various tombs and cemeteries have been searched and revealed the wealth of the city. The most famous artifact found there is called the Mask of Agamemnon, and it is a famous gold mask that you may have seen in picture. It always comes up to illustrate the Trojan War or the Mycenaean period. Beyond the heavy walls was the palace complex, organized around the Megaron, this grand hall, and around it the dozens and dozens of rooms in separate buildings that were storage rooms, workshops, and homes for the king, his court, and all the administrators, artisans, or guards that lived or worked in the palace. All the most important rooms had stone walls and wooden roofs, whereas the city around the palace was made of more perishable materials, like mud brick on stone foundations or wood. Of course, the state governed by Mycenae was not limited to the palace and its immediate surroundings. Beyond, there were agricultural villages and estates, roads, connections to ports for sea trade. This model of society, politics, and economy worked well until the late Bronze Age, and then it declined. So, what happened to put an end to the domination of this once thriving city? The fall was not sudden. It began between 1200 and 1100 BC. And like for other civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, that collapsed or receded at the same time, the reasons are complex and not fully resolved. This regional collapse of states that also affected the Egyptian New Kingdom or the Hittites could have been provoked by conflicts, obviously. There are archaeological evidence of destruction at this period at Mycenae and other palaces that support this possibility. But we don't know why or how. One theory, or rather a hypothesis that is inherently hard to prove, is that this could have had something to do with the replacement of bronze by iron. The transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age. Iron weapons were lighter and stronger, and they could have sparked more conflicts, maybe as different states rushed to acquire iron and feared others would do it first. So wars would have erupted. But this is rather speculative. There could also have been an invasion of newcomers that the Egyptians referred to as the Sea Peoples that would have disrupted the Eastern Mediterranean, and this could also have destabilized the Mycenaean area. Other causes may be more environmental, droughts that could have affected the whole Middle East and Mediterranean for several years, making the food supply drop. That's a good candidate to explain the late Bronze Age collapse, at least partially. Maybe resource depletion, which may be a good local explanation, but doesn't really work if we look at the big picture and see all these civilizations declining at the same time, because they could not have exhausted their lands all at once. Or, and this is also an element that sounds plausible, it is also possible that by becoming more and more dependent on trade and on a very tight administration of resources, with a large administration that could have been little flexible, Mycenae and other palaces became way more fragile. Their economic situation could have deteriorated suddenly due to external causes like trade disruption, and they would have become unable to adapt because of their bureaucracy, the way they functioned, leading to their decline. In any case, it happened, but as I said, not overnight. The first signs of destruction appear around 1200 BC, such as fires in the citadel, possibly from a conflict or internal unrest. But after that, some rebuilding occurred, so there was a recovery, temporarily. The final collapse really happened 50 years later, and it manifested with people abandoning the palace. Probably because resources no longer arrived there. The state had been disrupted. It had probably fallen apart, and nothing worked anymore. As larger settlements were no longer supplied by the countryside, urban centers in Greece disappeared. This is noted across Greece around 1100 BC, not just Mycenae. And this collapse was followed by 3 centuries called the Greek Dark Ages, that ended only around 800 BC. Post-collapse, Mycenae only retained a limited number of inhabitants, living in the deteriorating ruins of the large palace that had fallen into disrepair. It was never reoccupied on a large scale, and it turned to ruins. It was the end of the Mycenaean civilization, but as you understand, it had sown seeds, the language that would continue to evolve and become ancient Greek, the cultural references, a symbolic significance as seen in later Greek myths and epics like the Iliad, a material culture, even deities. Some of the gods of ancient Greece, like Poseidon, were already worshipped at the time of Mycenae. All of this would survive and be passed to the ancient Greek civilization. After 800 BC began the recovery, or the rise of this ancient Greek culture, with the first period that historians call Archaic Greece, followed by the periods we talked about at the beginning, the classical and Hellenistic periods. For our second visit tonight, we're going to travel far in time and space, because we are now heading to Mesoamerica, precisely to where the metropolitan area of Mexico City and its more than 20 million inhabitants spread. Before the capital of Mexico was founded there, long before the tens of thousands of buildings, the busy avenues and streets, there was the largest city of pre-Columbian America, exactly in the same place. In the middle of a lake, on an island, spectacular pyramids, temples, and a large concentration of buildings, perfectly organized in what was a marvel of urban planning and engineering, with canals that divided the city into a grid-like pattern of neighborhoods. The highest pyramid was located at the heart of the city, the Templo Mayor. It was topped with twin temples, one dedicated to the god of war and the sun, Huitzilopochtli, and the other to the god of rain, Tlaloc. But the central, sacred precinct where this pyramid stood had more buildings, other temples, ball courts, palaces. The other neighborhoods were placed around this central sacred place. But the transformation of the lake did not end there. Around the city, around Tenochtitlan, there were various artificial islands created by piling mud and vegetation in the lake to form small fields, fertile agricultural plots like floating gardens that were farmed intensively and formed like a green patchwork on the lake. If we could have walked the city or navigated on its canals, we would have seen a large number of adobe or stone houses with a single story, often clustered around courtyards where the commoners lived most of the population. People would go to markets to find everything they needed. Markets where they found fruits, beans, corn, cocoa, as well as objects for their homes, ceramics or textiles, and for those who could afford them, luxury items too, like colorful feathers or obsidian. As the water from the lake was not drinkable, aqueducts brought fresh water from springs on the mainland. Everywhere on the canals, canoes circulated all day, including under the walls of the fancy palaces of the elite. The emperor's palace was said to have hundreds of rooms, forming a complex of courtyards, gardens, causeways and fountains. In total, around 200,000 people lived there, a high number for the pre-industrial era. And Tenochtitlan was the capital of a growing and successful empire, the last large state to have emerged in Mesoamerica, the empire of the Aztecs. It was also a city-state, an altepetl, we will see what it meant, and it owed this very thought-out design to its planning. It had been rebuilt only a few decades before the arrival and conquest of the Spanish. To understand all that, once again, we need to rewind about 200 years to around 1325, when Tenochtitlan was founded on the lake. As you know, when the first large Spanish expedition landed in Mexico, led by Hernán Cortés in 1519, the leading power in Mesoamerica at the time was the Aztec Empire, which the Spanish soon came to realize. Not at first, because they had arrived quite south, but a few months later they marched on the Aztecs. However, this Aztec Empire was still very young in 1519. It had less than a century. Most of it had been built in the 15th century, only a few decades before the Spanish invasion. Before they built an empire, these people were a nomadic group called the Mexica. It spells with an X, like Mexico, but it is pronounced Mexica. So they were a nomadic group from northern Mexico, and in the 13th century, they migrated to the Valley of Mexico, a place where various city-states existed at the time. City-states like Chalco, Tlacopan, or Colhuacan. The Mexica settled on a hill near a large but shallow lake, Lake Texcoco, that no longer exists because it was drained in the following centuries to make space for Mexico City. Initially, their history was not very glorious. The Mexica were ousted from their hill by another people in 1299, so they moved, and they were expelled again in 1325. They found refuge on the lake itself, on a small island where they started building Tenochtitlan. The legend says that a prophecy had announced how the Mexica would find their promised land. They would see an eagle perched on a cactus holding a snake. And you have already seen this particular symbol, even if you don't remember it. It is on the coat of arms and the national flag of Mexico. So the arrival of the Mexica at Lake Texcoco and the foundation of Tenochtitlan were not really straightforward. They were pushed to this island on the lake by other, more powerful neighbors. They would make up for that later, but not immediately, because for about a century, the Mexica stayed on their island and made the best out of it, learning to use the water with canals for transportation and cultivate on floating gardens. But they were a minor presence in the Valley of Mexico, surrounded by wealthier and more powerful states that they sometimes served as mercenaries. Their imperial story really began in 1428, that is to say less than a century before the arrival of the Spanish, when they made an alliance called the Triple Alliance with two other city-states, two neighbors. And together, this Triple Alliance defeated another people, the Tepanecs, to gain dominance in the region. Then the Triple Alliance started an expansion out of the Valley of Mexico along the 15th century, subjugating other peoples of Mesoamerica by all means possible. Warfare, of course, but not only. There was also insistent diplomacy or blackmail, depending on how we want to see it, or strategic alliances, or marriages sometimes, so that a few decades and rulers later, they controlled much of central and southern Mexico. And the rule of the Aztecs was tough. They forced their vassal states to pay heavy tributes in gold, in feathers, food, or captives. And overall, they were not very popular. Their empire reigned by fear and might, not persuasion, which would also be their downfall, because there is no way the Spanish expedition could have conquered Mexico on its own. Cortés had 600 men, and despite their superior armament, because they had firearms, there is no way 600 men can conquer an empire that had 5 to 10 million subjects at the time, and around 200,000 in its capital alone. The invasion succeeded because on top of this small Spanish army, various peoples revolted against their masters all around the empire and allied with the Spanish. If you add to this the stunning effect of the arrival of these very weird strangers that seemed to announce the end of times, and in a sense for the Aztecs they did bring the end of times, and also the diseases introduced in Mexico that quickly spread, and you have the ingredients of the quick fall of the empire. But it would be exaggerated or simplistic to see the Aztecs as just a war-hungry and exploitative people. By the way, Mexica and Aztec are often synonyms, but not completely. The people that created the empire called themselves Mexica, and Aztec is a broader term. The Mexica are a people. The Aztecs are different people that were part of their empire. That's the nuance between the two terms. And that's why we call Aztec Empire the empire created by the Mexica. But I was saying their culture went far beyond warfare. When they arrived as a nomadic group in the Valley of Mexico, they came into contact with a huge cultural inheritance, thousands of years of Mesoamerican civilizations, with their discoveries, worldviews, the science, the craftsmanship of different peoples and states that had preceded them. They put their own twist on these, but that's how, in the 15th century, the Mexica that were a poor nomadic group a few decades later already had an intricate and complex art production, an elaborate calendar, and a good knowledge of astronomy. They also had a writing system, and everything they did, including sacrifices that seem cruel to us, everything they did was infused with meaning. It was not pointless violence. In the case of sacrifices, it was the necessity to honor and strengthen benevolent deities like Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, so they would defend the world against the forces of chaos and save humanity. The Aztecs were also fierce warriors, but they did not suppress other cultures. They integrated them, and sometimes their gods as well. The basic political organization of their empire, an equivalent to counties or city-states, was what they called Altepetl. Each Altepetl was a kind of city-state governed by a dynastic ruler. And this concept of Altepetl existed in Mesoamerica long before the Aztec Empire. So, when a new Altepetl would be added to the empire, its culture and administration would not be erased. It wouldn't be transformed into a new province. It would become part of the imperial alliance. Its ruler would pledge allegiance to the emperor. If need be, the ruler would be replaced by a new one that would be more docile. But the city-state, the Altepetl, kept its identity, its history, and its ethnicity, because each one had a distinct ethnicity. And it is why new Altepetl that were not Mexica, ethnically, could be Aztecs. That is to say, part of the political construction that was the empire. So the emperors ruled every Altepetl with an iron fist, but given that in the city-states each ruler still had jurisdiction on his territory, could raise troops, and eventually speak directly with the Spanish, this structure was a big weakness for the Aztec Empire. And in that sense, its organization was very different from the one of the other large empire destroyed by the Spanish, the Inca Empire. The Inca also fell and had to face rebellions during the Spanish conquest. But contrary to the Aztecs, they did absorb other peoples and even actively suppressed other cultures, by literally moving or deporting people away from their ancestral land, by hundreds or even thousands of miles, to eliminate their attachment to a land and transform them into subjects of the Sapa Inca, the emperor. But in Mexico, the Altepetl was a very important unit, and actually people referred to themselves not as belonging to a people in particular, like I am Mexica, they called themselves as residents or as belonging to a given Altepetl. The tribal alliance, the base of the Aztec Empire, included three. Tenochtitlan was one Altepetl, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, all neighbors on Lake Texcoco, and then many more joined them by force or persuasion. So when the Spanish army under Cortés went north to the heart of the Aztec Empire, they were first welcomed to Tenochtitlan by the emperor, Moctezuma II. But tensions erupted quickly. The emperor was killed in circumstances that remain unclear to this day. And what had begun like a diplomatic visit turned into war. The Spanish laid siege to Tenochtitlan, and with the help of their indigenous allies in revolt against Tenochtitlan, and also the help of smallpox, the disease that they had inadvertently brought to the city, they took it in August 1521. And that was the end of the glorious capital. Cortés believed that in order to mark the beginning of a new era, Tenochtitlan should be destroyed and replaced with a new city. And so all the temples, palaces, and beautiful monuments were razed, the stone reused to build a new city. Many inhabitants stayed, though, and as soon as its foundation, Mexico City became the largest city in the Americas, with more than 100,000 people, most of them survivors of the siege of Tenochtitlan. And this is how the capital of the Mexica, that seemed to float on a lake and was one of the largest cities of its time in the world, disappeared. Lake Texcoco disappeared too under the growth of Mexico City, that became a tentacular metropolis in the 20th century. And remains of Tenochtitlan mostly disappeared. Mostly, but not entirely. Parts of the foundations of the Templo Mayor, the highest pyramid, that had the temples of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc atop. So parts of these foundations were accidentally rediscovered under the city in 1978, including a massive stone disc that was part of it. Excavations around the main central square of Mexico City, the Zócalo, have also uncovered remnants of Aztec structures, parts of palaces, walls, ceremonial platforms that were all leveled in 1521 and after, and used as foundations for the new city. And this is logical because when you stand on the square, on the Zócalo, la Plaza de la Constitución officially, you are just where the most sacred and most elite part of Tenochtitlan was located 500 years ago. This is the end of our story for tonight. You may now let go and fall asleep. Or, if you're not sleepy yet, pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with a new one. And in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.